Welcome to Public Access TV is Different, Digitizing the Video Access Project. My name is Mia Ferm. I'm a recent graduate from the Preservation and Presentation of the Moving Image MA program at the University of Amsterdam, and for the last 10 years I have also been a curator and co-director of Cinema Project, a Portland-based collective that presents public screenings of experimental film and video. The introductory clip you just saw proclaiming that Public Access TV is different was an electronic graphic created at the Portland Cable Access Studios in the early 1980s, and was used as an interstitial between segments or at the end of programs. And the iteration you just saw came from the end of a program produced by the Video Access Project, who broadcast their programs from the Portland Cable Access Studios and Liberty Cable Studios in Portland. As part of my practical coursework as an MA candidate, I started interning at the Oregon Historical Society in fall 2020, working with a collection of 3/4-inch u-matic tapes related to Portland Public Access Television and specifically the Video Access Project, or TVAP as you might hear me refer to it. What I'll talk about today is the ongoing project at the Oregon Historical Society to digitize a collection of almost 300 3/4-inch u-matic tapes from the 1980s related to the Video Access Project, and some of the ethical considerations that I came across when working with the public access television content on u-matic tape. Two main issues will be highlighted. First, when, why, and whether or not to intervene during capture, that is, whether or not to make adjustments to things like color balance or exposure levels. And second, considerations for description and access related to the reuse of 3/4-inch u-matic tapes, which was common, but in situations where some of the previous content still appears at the head or tail of a tape, for example. Some of these things will be familiar to those working with amateur film and video, home movies, or experimental film and video. Public access television and my case study here of the Video Access Project were often produced by semi-professionals, amateurs, and volunteers, eager to put the tools of television in their own hands. So in that spirit, I wanted to share with others interested in these materials how these issues have been considered during my internship and from the perspective of someone like me who has recently transitioned into video preservation. I've tried to pack in as many images and clips to help illustrate these points, but of course also to give folks the opportunity to witness some truly unique and enduring content from the early days of public access television in Portland, Oregon. So to begin, what exactly is the Video Access Project? I'll let this clip from a 1982 broadcast help me describe it.
TVAP Presents is a weekly live TV forum intended to entertain and educate, and also to acquaint you with community access television. This is a free service provided by a crew of volunteers. If you have a program idea or would like to become involved as a guest or as a crew member, call the Video Access Project or your cable company.
So TVAP is a show, a platform, a resource, and a project that sought to connect people to and through public access television. And it did this by offering its airtime and volunteer production crew to other community groups, artists, activists, and musicians in town, rather than producing a regular show on a particular theme. For example, depending on what side of the city you lived on, you could tune in to your public access channel the same day and time each week and find programming that varied from week to week, but all produced by the Video Access Project. For example, one week you might get an hour with the Northwest Artists Workshop, who presented on local arts and culture events. Another week, it could be an interview show like Francis Kostikian's guest book. Other groups also use the platform to present a 20 or 30-minute segment as part of a 1 or 2 hour block of TVAP programming. For example, a September 1983 episode including an update from the Northwest Esperanto Society, a live in-studio jam session with local jazz musicians, and interviews with members of the Institute for Professional and Managerial Women. Call-in shows were also quite popular. Considering this diversity in programming, there are two things I wanted to highlight. First, what TVAP was producing was only a fraction of all content on public access channels. But given how it functioned as a platform for other groups, it provides us with a rich cross-section of what was being broadcast at the time. And second, the variety of groups and individuals involved meant not every segment was made the same way with the same engineers or studio personnel, and often with a volunteer, semi, or non-professional crew. Keeping these things in mind, I'll describe briefly the video signal chain, which will allow me to mention a few of the key pieces of equipment in use. We start, of course, with our playback device, the u-matic VTR. Then the video signal goes through a switcher to the time-based corrector, or TBC, through a box to convert the BNC cable to RCA into a DV-Cam deck, and then to a Mac computer where Adobe Premiere Pro is used to capture and digitize. Other elements along the signal chain include other switchers, some CRT monitors, a sync generator, and the waveform and vector scope monitor. And just a quick note about the use of the DV-Cam deck. There are a few reasons for moving away from this setup, but that's a topic for another time, and I would recommend replacing the DV-Cam deck with something like a Blackmagic capture device. Once I began digitizing these tapes, one thing I started noticing was that sometimes there was not just a difference in the look and tone between different programs or segments on an episode, which you would expect, but that within the same segment there might be a big difference from camera to camera. So one shot would have levels that fell within standard broadcast range for brightness and depth, while the next might be blown out with a green or magenta hue. In trying to make a good quality digital surrogate that accurately represents the original, I started to wonder how much intervention was appropriate. I don't want to take too many creative liberties, and I want to respect the material as it is, but I also want to capture as much visual and oral information as possible. As an example, I wanted to show this broadcast from February 3rd, 1984, and in this segment the guests are discussing a school closure. So far it looks pretty good, although the color saturation might be a little high, but we've got some differentiation between the host speaking and the background. And using a waveform monitor, I would be able to see if the brightness or depth is consistently out of range or not. The tone isn't too green, but maybe a little more magenta. And then it cuts to another camera, and we see a big difference from the brightness levels to the hue. So should we do anything about it? I would say a limited yes, but at what point in the process, during capture or by manipulating the digital file? I found that during capture made the most sense in this scenario. First, because I think it limits the extent of intervention. There are just so many changes, finer and more minute, that can be made using post-production software. Is that bad? Not necessarily, but I would be wary of crossing a line of creative control. And color correcting shot by shot, even with the best software, can be very time consuming. Another reason is that we can use the processing amp on the time-based corrector to make adjustments during capture. And this is a tool that would have been available at the time of creation, making a more quote-unquote authentic adjustment. So you can see here on the time-based corrector, or TBC, the section with the buttons and knob labeled proc amp / effects. And there are 4 attributes that can be adjusted, represented by Y/poster, black / stretch, C / solar, and hue / sepia. And by using the waveform monitor and vector scope, along with a calibrated CRT monitor, I can make some reasonable adjustments. And I use the proc amp to adjust the following: highlights using the Y levels, darkness using the black levels, the color saturation using C levels, and the hue using hue. So I'll show the same clip again about the school closure without any adjustments, alongside the one where I did make adjustments.
Good evening. I'm Deborah Clay. This evening we'll be talking with members of the Jackson Education Coalition, the organization that is trying to reopen the school by having the Jackson area form a separate school district. Until August of 1983, the coalition was winning every contest with the Portland School District. In August 1983, the plan for secession was rejected by the State Board of Education.
So what I decided to do was bring the color saturation and brightness down a little, setting an average across the entire segment. I do think the host is missing a little pop of color from before, but I think this helped to take some of the green tint off of the guests. But something I also discovered in this process is that the color saturation would change just, depending on which VTR I was using, which for me is an argument for not trying to fine-tune things too much. Before shifting gears, I want to show one more example because I think it really demonstrates the interesting things you might find on public access. And the clip I'm about to show is a seance performed live in studio on October 30th, 1980. As you'll see, one camera tends toward green while the other magenta. So if I adjusted the hue of one camera, it would just exacerbate the hue of the other. Instead, I just adjusted the brightness and depth very minimally to keep within broadcast range. So, you know, it's a seance, it's supposed to be relatively dark, and who knows, maybe the green and magenta hues lend an otherworldly quality to the image.
Please, this is much easier now to speak. Thank you all for your patience in waiting for me to come completely through. I am simply here to introduce myself. I am John, and I come from the world of the spirit, if you may accept this.
Yes, gladly.
I simply come in to bear greetings to those who are listening and witnessing the presence of spirit. We are here in the God light and come of the higher consciousness. We are not demonic by any measure of your imaginations.
No, of course not.
We simply wish to express our gratitude in bringing forth this experiment. There is a entity most anxious to come in through the male medium. Would you please now, when you are ready?
Another issue I came across that is probably common, if not standard, to public access television is the recycling or reuse of 3/4-inch u-matic tapes. So first off, reusing u-matic tapes was common for television across the board. Tapes could be used several times, which made them more cost-effective, and this is part of what made them more attractive to the broadcast television industry over something like 16mm film, which you obviously can't reuse. Ideally, before a tape was reused, it would have been fully erased, but sometimes that didn't always happen. In the TVAP Collection of the Historical Society, I've come across several tapes that have remnants or leftover fragments at the beginning or end of the tape. And usually it's just at the very, very end, sometime after the tape cuts to black, but sometimes it's more prominent. So let's look at one example. As you can see when inspecting the tape case alone, there are a couple of layers of labels that have been ripped off and then labeled over. So this is a first clue that the tape was probably recycled. And then looking at the cassette, the label indicates that this is a segment from May 25th, 1984, entitled Happenings at Pioneer Square with Bill Bulick. Again, the label is obviously taped on top of a previous label. When we run the video, however, the first thing we see is a title card for something called The Dan Halverson Show, where the topic is nuclear survival, reality, or farce. But immediately after that, we get color bars and then the segment on arts programming that matches the tape label. At the end of the segment, however, and after about 30 seconds of black, we get the remainder of the Dan Halverson Show. The tape was just not properly erased before reuse. Is this significant? Should we care? If we assume that the entirety of the tape should be captured and digitized, keeping in mind concepts of provenance, I think this example draws out questions about how to describe the content, and even more significant, how to give access to it. We don't know if the reuse of the tape was intentional. Maybe the producers of the Dan Halverson show didn't want copies of the show being made for whatever reason, and the tape was chucked in a bin for the purposes of reuse. Or maybe it was just a hasty decision made out of necessity. It was a tape laying around and someone needed one right away. We just don't know. Part of the project to digitize this collection of TVAP programming is to make it available to the public on the Oregon Historical Society's digital collection site. And a remaining question I have as part of this project is whether or not to make available the whole tape as it was digitized, or just the segment mentioned on the tape label, like in this example. My inclination would be to make just the segment mentioned on the label available to the public, while retaining a digital preservation copy of the tape in its entirety. But of course, there are also other copyright issues to consider. But the history of television media and these fragments or remnants, I think they might be interesting to a wider public than just moving image archivists. So to wrap up, I want to show just one more clip that I think really describes the spirit of public access television and the Video Access Project in particular. This is a clip from a September 12th, 1984 broadcast. It shows the Portland-based Latin jazz band Ayla performing in studio. And this clip with Ayla was used several times as filler at the end of other programs, but in this iteration you'll see the studio engineers decided to add some scrolling text at the bottom of the frame. Anyway, thank you to all the AMIA folks who put together the spring conference, and to all of you watching for your attention. Here's Ayla from 1984 on the Video Access Project.